I am delighted we have such a full house in person, such a full house online. This is being live streamed and recorded and will be publicized. My name is Katerina Linos. I'm a professor of international law here and co-director of the Miller Institute for Global Challenges in the Law. And my job is to take a minute to introduce our speakers and to explain the format of the Q&A. Before I do that, let me thank Ms. Toni Mendocino and Michele Piergiovanni who pulled this event together. Last time we tried to have EVP Vestager here, we had to go to the chancellor. This time it was so wonderful and we hope there will be many returns. The Q&A will work as follows. We'll just start with Q&A. So Professor Bradford will start asking questions, and then in the corridors on my right, Toni and Jesse on the left, you'll write your questions on cards. They will come to Anu, and we'll also get some online questions from the chat that way. Many of you know EVP Vestager, whom the New York Times call the most powerful regulator of big tech on the planet, and the person Silicon Valley fears most. You might know about her investigations of Google, Apple, and Facebook and the billion-dollar fines. You might know if you came to the Riesenfeld 2 years ago where she won our biggest award, you might know that she got this not only because of her enforcement activity, but because she had succeeded 2 years ago to get two major pieces of legislation, the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act, through the 27 member states of the EU. And of course, she has not been resting on her laurels. She's managed to negotiate a revised AI Act, details coming out in January, and also begin investigations on misinformation on X, Elon Musk's platform. So there is a lot to talk about her and her agenda. And there's nobody better to ask some questions than Professor Anu Bradford from Columbia Law School, who is best known for her book, The Brussels Effect, about why regulations made in Brussels impact California and the entire world when Brussels has no army and a small budget. That's her first bestseller. Her newest book, Digital Empires, compares the European, the Chinese, and the American approaches to digital regulation and makes key predictions about our future. So without more, I am passing on the microphone to Professor Bradford. Please join me in a round of applause.
Thank you so much, Professor Linos, and good afternoon to all of you. It is truly a pleasure and an honor to be able to engage in a conversation with Executive Vice President Vestager on the issue that I think all of us just care so deeply about. So I really wanted to start by asking you to look at the big picture, what has been accomplished. So if you look at the amount of legislation, significant, ambitious legislation that has been passed during this mandate of the Commission. So there was first the GDPR, but during this last 5 years, we've had the Digital Markets Act, the Digital Services Act, the Data Act, the Data Governance Act, the AI Act, now a directive to protect the rights of platform workers. It is a dizzying amount of law, especially if you contrast that to the United States Congress, where we don't really see anything meaningful coming out. So maybe if you could start to help us understand, what is the sort of grand theory behind all these laws? What kind of digital economy and society are these laws designed to then bring about?
Well, first and foremost, very happy to be here. I hope you enjoy your lunch. I know it's good because we just had exactly the same thing. Very happy to be here. And I think the question is well placed, because now I think it's the time to take a step back and to see if it is obvious why we have passed these sweeping pieces of legislation. And it may sound trivial because it sounds very simple. The point is to make sure that citizens can trust that the digital economy, that digital markets are serving them. Those are the fundamentals, because that should also be one of the fundamentals of capitalism, that you serve the customer, and since we are all as citizens also customers, that there is a sort of deeply rooted democratic approach to this. And that has been the very point, because what we have seen since digitization began, now decades ago, is that this has fundamentally changed how markets work. It has fundamentally changed the role of data. And early on, I think everyone was a bit sort of hands-off, saying what will happen, how will this develop? And only within the last 5-7 years, realizing that you need to do much more than keeping your hands off. Starting with the GDPR, sort of ingraining the rights to privacy, the right to be forgotten, the right to govern your own data, but then taking that much, much further in also creating the infrastructure of a digitalized world building on data, so the Data Act, the Data Governance Act, making sure that the service providers, and we're talking about relatively few big companies who provide essential infrastructure, that they live up to the very simple that with great powers also comes great responsibility. I think that characterizes both the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act. And then, of course, having learned from the effects of not regulating, starting very early on to regulate artificial intelligence. And doing that in parallel with the development of the G7 Code of Conduct, the US executive order, the very good relationship we have with the US within the framework of the Tech and Trade and Technology Council, also sort of show that we have learned from what it means to have hands off, and instead not to meddle, not to detail, but to have a real relationship with what is going on in the marketplace when it comes to AI, using a lot of code of practices and being risk-based in order to allow for innovation. And that would be my last point. You hear about all these pieces of regulation. At the same time, there is an effort for massive investment in innovation, in getting to the market, in enabling a good use of technology in our jurisdiction, which is the European Union.
Right, so we definitely want to get to the question of innovation, but let's first talk a little bit about enforcing this very ambitious agenda. So I think there is a consensus that the legislative ability of the EU is really impressive, but there have been some concerns whether this agenda is actually enforceable. So there have been 4 cases against Google, the antitrust cases, but many would say that, look, the market is not competitive, even though these cases have taken place. And in many ways, that is the reason the Commission has now acquired new tools. So we have the Digital Markets Act, we have the Digital Services Act, that present kind of a turning point in the tools that the Commission has at its disposal. So if you could maybe comment a little bit about the enforcement challenges, what is your own assessment of the enforcement record to date? What explains some potential deficiencies, and will that change with these new tools that we now have in place?
Now, over the last 10 years, there's been not 1, not 2, not 3 Google cases. We're now on number 4. We've had the same number of Amazon cases. We now have 2 open Apple cases, one on Apple Pay, one on Apple Music, and we have a case with Meta and the use of their marketplace with Facebook and how the 2 are tied. And what I have learned over the years doing all these cases is that it takes a lot to make sure that harm that has been done can also be repaired. When we take a decision, a prohibition decision, there's a fine to punish past behavior. You're told to stop what you're doing. And thirdly, not to put anything in place that would have the equivalent effect. But if businesses have died in the meantime, And because of that not being able to serve customers, well, there is an obvious customer harm. In other cases where we have taken commitments, for instance, the first Amazon case on ebooks, we took far-reaching commitments to enable other ebook providers to have a fair play. That has made sure that the ebook market has stayed open and competitive. So I think you have quite a mixed bag, and we have quite to learn from that. And obviously, one of the main insights is that we need to gain speed. Speed is of the essence. And since there is an inherent imbalance between those who break the law and those who enforce the law, because as law enforcer, obviously, you're bound by rules of due process, of access to file, of having the right evidence, there is a complete asymmetry here. So obviously, there is a limit as to how fast we can be compared to the lawbreaker. But what we can achieve by complementing our case-by-case law enforcement with the Digital Markets Act is that we say ex ante. So basically, before the game begins, you need to put these things in place. For instance, that you enable that your device can carry a second or a third app store. That as a user, you can sideload if you find your apps somewhere else than in the App Store. That your data is not being used to compete against you if you're in a marketplace. That there is access to the operating system for developers so that their products can actually get to you as customers with the same functionality, with the same speed that would otherwise maybe not possible. And I think that is the point, to sort of to change the game so that we know that this has to be in order ex ante, instead of what is the fundamental characteristic of law enforcement. You only enforce the law when you realize that the law has been broken. And that, I think, will give a new dynamic. And the last thing is, of course, that from my services, we cannot know everything that is going on because we are not the app developers. We're not the customers. So what is absolutely needed is, of course, a community of parties looking for the compliance that they need in order to compete in the marketplace and serve you well as customers. And this is why now, 7th of March is a very crucial date, because this is when you have to comply with the Digital Markets Act if you've been labeled a gatekeeper. Is that the changes by the gatekeepers, sort of the beta versions of those are tested in the marketplace so that it is obvious that this will actually work. Because this is the only way really to get to enforcement, that there is this engagement by those who should benefit from a new and much more open marketplace. Because otherwise, if it was only us, we would run into very, very severe resource constraints for quite obvious reasons. The digital economy is enormous and it's increasing by the minute, in depth and in scope. So we need to do things that I think maybe some would think is unprecedented, but I think that's the only way to go about it.
So I wanted to build on that and ask a little bit about the engagement with the tech companies, the targets of the regulation themselves. So while here in California, you're meeting with some of the chief executives of the tech companies, you are in the middle of a consultation process when you're trying to get a sense how they are responding to this new legislation. So is your sense generally that you expect there to be a lot of voluntary compliance, that the tech companies have accepted this is the new reality, this is how the rules will work, and we will proactively comply? Or are you gearing up for extensive battles and litigation? So maybe you can shed a little bit of light on what is the tone of that conversation and how contested you expect these to be in the coming years when the enforcement effort really is underway.
Well, I think in terms of law enforcement, I'm a very old woman. And I have seen a lot. I said, not one, not two, not three. We are on our 4th Google case. We have cases with all big tech, all of those who are now gatekeepers. So to assume that everything will just be fine, I think would be to discard of all the experience that I have gained for the last 10 years. it doesn't change my fundamental surprise that some of these amazing, successful companies still find it necessary to do things that make us open investigations and conclude investigations, as we have done, to find that they have broken the law. So we approach this with a constructive, but I think also realistic mindset that it may indeed be necessary for us to open non-compliant cases. Because I think if complied with the Digital Markets Act, there will be changes to your business model. And since this business model has worked very well for these companies, I don't think that they will change without at least a bit of resistance. So, of course, we prepare both for non-compliant cases. We give advice, but of course, our advice cannot take the place of the responsibility of the gatekeepers themselves to decide these are the changes that we will put in place, because it is their responsibility, even though we have kept sort of an open door since the DMA came into effect, in order to try to guide what we think would be sort of a path to compliance.
It's a very good one. Comment that one often hears from the tech companies or the US business communities, that there is some doubting of the motivations of the Commission, that there is this sense that actually this legislative effort rests on this envy-driven foundation, that it is an attempt to really try to level the playing field and increase the relative opportunities for European companies to compete, because they haven't been as successful as the American tech companies. So I wonder whether you ever confront this criticism of protectionism, and whether you can help us understand why protectionism is not the driving force behind these cases, because they are targeting American companies. The DMA in particular, if you look at who are the gatekeepers, who are the designated ones, there is a correlation between the designated companies and their nationality.
Well, this is one of the questions that we have dealt with from the very first day. Actually, also when it comes to the specific case-by-case law enforcement, this is something that I've been faced with. It's just because that they're American. And because of that, of course, we have been discussing this intensively, how to make sure that people see that this is about the open, innovative, contestable marketplace, which of course ought to fit, hand in glove with all American values. That everyone should have a fair chance of making it in the marketplace. And this is also why I think we can fully defend that this is not about your nationality, where you're headquartered. This is about responsibility when you have market power. Because what has happened over these last 10, 15 years is that some companies provide essential infrastructure that other market participants depends on in order to get to their customers. And of course, I would be more than happy if we had more European gatekeepers, but actually even more happy if any future big tech company would be so contested that they wouldn't grow into gatekeeping, but they would grow organically into being part of a contestable marketplace. Because I think that caters for innovation. And since we're now stepping into a situation where artificial intelligence will play a role that can take many different dimensions, it's a wide-ranging conversation. I think even more so that it's important to make sure that we don't get complete entrenchment by those who provide these essential infrastructures.
So absolutely, let me build on you mentioned innovation, because that is another criticism that one often hears. And it was also a conversation towards the last stages of negotiating the AI Act, is that what does this regulation does to innovation in general and to European innovation in particular? Is it compatible with this innovative agenda, the growth of new companies, or is regulation always prone to stifle innovation? So are you worried about compliance? Because there certainly was a conversation with the GDPR that it was disproportionately burdening the small companies, whereas the large companies had the resources to comply. So how would you describe the relationship between this digital agenda and the Europe's vision around innovation?
Well, first and foremost, the obvious is that you need to innovate to comply with the law.
Yeah.
So in that respect, any kind of regulation would push companies to think of new ways of doing things. That should not be sort of an excuse to regulate more. You don't regulate to innovate. You regulate because you want a different market behavior. But it has been part and parcel of the discussion. And the latest has been on the AI Act, how to make sure that you still have a piece of legislation that will enable innovation. And I think one of the fundamentals of the AI Act is that it doesn't touch innovation and research. It comes into effect once you go to market. And the second thing is that it is asymmetrical. So the bigger you are, the more responsibility, because the more capable you are, the more effects in the marketplace. And because of that, also the more risks, for instance, for people being discriminated. If an AI system is used for acceptance to university, if you can get a mortgage, if you can get insurance. So we use that asymmetry quite a lot so that the little one actually have some time to grow. Same asymmetry actually is also characteristics of the Digital Services Act. Big companies have different responsibilities, for instance, for a risk assessment of how their services work, which is not the same for the smaller company. Then we make quite big use of what we call sandboxing, so that companies and authorities can actually talk about how do we live up to the ideas, the letter and the spirit of this legislation. And for the AI Act, we will rely quite a lot on code of practices, so that the enforcement and compliance to the regulation can develop with time and with technology. And I think that is absolutely crucial. And the last thing, of course, is, and this is why the asymmetry is important, is that we do not, by regulation, create a situation where, as you said, it's only possible for the big ones to live up to this, and the smaller ones, they just basically have to give up. That the bigger ones, they can take up the ladder and say, the rest of you, you'd never make it. And that has also been part and parcel of the AI Act and the discussions about it, to make it possible for the smaller, the upcomings, the scale-ups, to be part of what I think is a very promising development to much more AI-guided economic development.
So Bill, actually exactly on this point, we have a first student question on the AI Act. And the student wants to know how you regulate AI when we don't really know yet where the technology is going. So how were you thinking about the AI Act so that it applies to the AI products and systems that are out there, but at the same time that is capable of regulating the kinds of applications that have not yet been innovated? So how do you think about this sort of future-proof AI Act in light of the rapid developments in the technology?
Well, I think the first thing here is to realize that we have learned from the fact that we did not regulate technology in sort of the first big chapter of technology. It was very much also in Europe hands-off. And that's, I think, enabled this entrenchment that we see. It enabled a very fundamental change of market dynamics for, as we say, gatekeepers to a very large degree decide if other companies can be successful or not. And looking at the power of AI and the potential of AI, if you do not regulate, the risk, of course, is that you get an even deeper entrenchment, an even deeper change in how market dynamics works, without having any kind of guarantee that it will still be dynamics that works to serve the customer, and that it will be dynamics that serves to create trust in how technology is working. Because for us, we see that the use of technology, the embrace of technology, very much comes from you being able to trust it, that it is something that will serve us as humans and not the other way around. Or rather that it will serve very few humans and the rest of us, we will basically just be part of the product. So that was sort of the general idea. And we tabled the proposal before generative AI sort of really became a publicly known feature. So the legislation has undergone some changes in the debates between the legislators of the European Parliament and the Council. But the fundamental structure of the legislation is basically unchanged. And that is that it is risk-based. So it's not the technology in itself that is regulated, with the exception of some obligations of generative AI or general purpose AI. It is how it's being used. If you used to do a recommender system for what music to hear or what film to see, we're like, yeah, well, here actually you can easily do something else. If it's a bot that is helping you through a procedure or doing customer service, nice to know that you're not speaking with a human, but that would be it. But much more, of course, intrusive in our lives if it is a system that is being used in a situation where it is crucial that we're not being discriminated, but seen as who we are. And last but not least, that there are use cases where we'd find this is actually not in accordance with European values. Sort of, for instance, state surveillance systems that will give you points as a citizen. So there is a group of use cases that are simply forbidden. And in doing so, we find that we have something which is future-proof because it allows for a lot of different sorts of AI to develop in the years to come. And I obviously don't know as little as anyone else, but I think from what we know now, the big language models, we will see many other sorts of artificial intelligence develop over the years to come.
So if you think about the AI race in general, and it is dominated by American companies and Chinese companies, so it's very concentrated on where AI development takes place and where we expect those profits to emerge. So do you think the Europeans should just concede the race? So are you optimistic about the innovation future of Europe? So maybe to say a few words, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on why Europe has not been as successful recently to develop large tech companies. And what would it take for that to change and for Europe to be not just the regulator, not just the referee, but really the player that develops some of the cutting edge AI technologies alongside with American and Chinese companies?
Well, I think it's a bit of a hidden truth that Europe is very innovative, that you see a lot of innovation in Europe. You see also a lot of that innovation ending up as fueling American companies' success. If you look at the last years, you'd see that there's been like a shopping spree by US companies, you know, sort of an old school Sex and the City, a lot of bags shopping spree. Going to Europe for innovative companies. And of course, part of that is due to omissions in the European development. 10 years ago, the digital single market was not at all developed. The capital markets still missing out. We are getting there, but still there is not the same dynamics when it comes to venture capital in a European context as what you see in the US. So building a capital market with the same dynamics, making sure that the single market in Europe is also vibrant when it comes to scaling up within Europe. And then, of course, sort of on the more sort of strict side of things, saying, well, actually, we also want to see in merger control some of these acquisitions. To make sure that they're not acquisitions that closes the market, makes it more difficult for other developers. And you'd see that, for instance, in the Google Fitbit acquisition, where we enable that other developers could still connect with the Android operating system. You see that in the Microsoft Activision clearance, where again, we enabled access. So you see here that there is a merger approach, there's a capital approach, there is a market approach to make sure that Europe can play a bigger role. And last but not least, now this new big chapter of digitization is very much in sort of the business to business innovation side of things. And Europe has a very strong industrial culture. a culture for creating machinery of all sorts. So in that respect, I think there is a stronger preparedness, there's a stronger sense of knowledge to use technology for exactly that. Where in the US and where Europe completely lost the race was in the consumer-facing technology. And this is, of course, where you see the big US companies being very, very successful in Europe. Some US companies actually being more successful in Europe than what they are in the American market.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I really take a lot of comfort in some of those issues, including capital markets and the completion of the digital single markets being on your radar as really essential elements of the fundamental pillars of the European tech ecosystem. Let me bring another student question here. So there are reasons why you are seen not just a regulator for Europe, but regulator for the world. So I've written previously about the Brussels effect, how the European regulations, including the digital regulations, often have an effect outside of European borders. So we have a student who wants to know whether you believe that these practices by the big tech companies that you are now targeting with the Digital Markets Act or Digital Services Act will actually change their practices outside of Europe as well. So will we see a shift in the US, India, South Africa, South America and Africa as a result of these regulatory efforts?
Well, two comments to that. First, we see a lot of jurisdictions being inspired and also considering, should we regulate? I think it started very much with GDPR, so privacy legislation. See California very early on, very early adapter to have privacy legislation here. India just passed privacy legislation. They have learned from our experiences, but basically also being very inspired to do so. Lots of other jurisdictions the same. Now we see the same on some of the other pieces of legislation that other jurisdictions, they watch, they discuss, they draft in order to see, can we take some of the same steps? And that, I think, also informs how businesses look at this. Because if they realize this is going to be a global phenomenon, that things are changing, then obviously, why not just take it on board and get it over with to establish this change? And here I think the public also comes in. If you look at the Digital Services Act, here big service provider, very large online platforms will have to make a risk assessment of how their services work. Could there be a risk, for instance, to mental health by using these services? You probably remember Frances Hogan, whistleblower from Facebook when it was Facebook, on Instagram, claiming that Instagram very well know that there is a risk to especially young women's mental health, but that they just didn't care. That was her assessment. When companies do that kind of risk assessment and, of course, mitigate those risks if they find them, and they are obliged to have external auditing of their risk assessment and their mitigation, I would think that it would be difficult to say we do that for the EU market only, but we don't care about what risk our services might pose to young people in other jurisdictions. Here, I think people, citizens, customers would say, oh, come on. If you care about citizens in one place, we expect you also to care about our mental health. So I think that we are engaging in some new dynamics with the inspiration for legislators, with the changes that they are obliged to go through, and with customer citizen expectations as to what it means to be a good corporate tech citizen.
So very good. Maybe we can talk now a little bit more about, in generally, your relationship with your counterparts in the United States, where you see the US is going. Do you sense in your conversations here that there is a shift in the conversations in the US? You will certainly witness now an array of antitrust cases against the big tech companies. Do you take credit for that? Do you think they are looking at what you have accomplished in Europe and think that, okay, we cannot just outsource the enforcement to the Europeans. We also need to look after our consumers with the US laws, with the US enforcement efforts. So how would you describe the undergoing shift in the US, and what do you think that will amount to in the end?
Well, very difficult to say what the US legislature will decide. But at least I sense that the atmosphere has changed a lot. When I first came here almost 10 years ago with my first Google case and climbing the hill in Washington, it was like, what is that woman doing? Don't she realize this is a national treasure? That has changed a lot. Not to say it has changed completely. There's a completely different sense of we need the marketplace to work. I've had both robust discussions with the senators, but also sort of much more inspiring, amicable discussion with senators saying we want to, we have a parallel way of thinking about this. We want to do the same thing. Now, not really materializing in legislation that has been passed, but there is a very changed atmosphere. When you see what comes out in the White House 2 years ago over summer, executive order on competition as such, it was like Christmas all year round for someone like me. This new focus on making sure that markets are competitive to serve European citizens in everything from hearing aids to internet connections. And then, of course, the new people on the watch in the FTC and the DOJ being very active, having a very different, I think, approach, but drawing on some of the very strong legislation that you have in the US. Actually, the US informed the European Union when we were shaped in the 50s as to what kind of antitrust legislation should we have. The Sherman Law was very inspirational in that respect. So I think that there is a dynamic, there is a back and forth between the jurisdictions. And I think it is important because that, of course, also shapes the corporate mind as to what to expect from the law enforcer. And then the deterrence of the cases that we do is much stronger. And that is, of course, is the better effect. It is for businesses to say, we won't even bother. We just follow the law because it's too burdensome if they find out anyway.
So very good. I think this is now something that I wanted to build on a little bit and discuss some contention in the transatlantic relationship. And one has been the subsidies. So we certainly have now entered a different era, some would say that the post-neoliberalist era of our economy, where the state is more forcefully back in. The geopolitical tensions, national security concerns, the US-China tech and trade rivalry has really shifted the policy making. And my sense is that the Europeans are also responding to this shift. So there was a lot of contestation around the IRA that was passed in the US, where you could say that the US is doing actually very effectively. So its subsidy program has been very effective. And we have a student question here on state aid and green investments. So you have a reputation of being a strong defender of the single market, being a strong defender of competition, and not that willing to see state aid distort that competition. But at the same time, now we see the European Union approving increasingly state aid. So a student wanted to know whether the state-by-state approach to investment and state aid in the EU is suboptimal to the US compared to the IRA, so it's not as effective, but it also then may distort the single market and its operations. So maybe you have some comments on that, where we are in state aid.
This is one of the main discussions in Europe, how to make sure that we get the balance right. Because just as here, there is a difference as to what member states are rich and what member states are not that rich. Also because they're different in size, so not everyone would have the same opportunities. The thing is that since the world came together in Paris and decided that we would fight climate change, we have been in this global transition that has been politically initiated. Some of the other transitions of our global, of our societies and the global economy has been very much technology driven, like the Industrial Revolution, like the revolution that came with the invention of pesticides and fertilizers. So very much driven of technology of different sorts. Now we have a transition that is very much politically driven. There was a political commitment to say, we will change how our economy works. We will change how we produce energy. We will change how industry is fed. And the market has not been able to deliver like this as fast as is needed. So we very much consider it a market failure that the market cannot deliver what is the political obligation towards citizens that we can fight climate change. And this is one of the reasons why we find that it's absolutely legitimate that the states step in and subsidize where necessary. And the point in Europe is that we're in control of the subsidies. We know what subsidies are being paid out. If they disturb competition, we can ask for mitigating measures. And for some of the big projects, we can make sure that they have a truly sort of European effects. We have what we call important projects of common European interest, IPCIs, where this is indeed one of the tests. There is a strong difference to the US. First and foremost, I think it's just really, really good to see the US really stepping up and stepping in fighting climate change, which is one of the basic features of the Inflation Reduction Act. We've asked that for a very long time, and here we see it. The thing is that the subsidies of the Inflation Reduction Act is enabled in a very different way than what you see in Europe. In Europe, you would get a grant, you would get a subsidized loan, you would get a guarantee for your bank loan. Here, you'd get a tax benefit. And that, of course, makes the dynamic very different. Now, we have put in place different measures to enable support in Europe so that all investment do not travel to the US. So I think we are in a more balanced situation right now. And that also allows us to look at the subsidies that we see in a Chinese context, because they may be much more far-reaching, because it's not only subsidies to enable in-market success, it's also subsidies that may allow for global market success. And this is why we have put in place what is called the Foreign Subsidies Act, to make sure that we can look for foreign government subsidies coming into the European Union, making it very difficult for European companies and for other companies, for that matter, that comes from an unsubsidized situation, actually to compete. So I think by now we are see more eye to eye with our American counterparts, also because important discussions within the framework of the Trade and Technology Council. And that allows us also to focus on what we see from the Chinese side and how subsidies are being paid out there. And last but not least, for instance, both on semiconductors and within the Inflation Reduction Act subsidies, we have very good subsidy dialogues with our US counterparts in order to enable transparency. Because the first thing when it comes to avoiding a subsidy race is transparency. Can we see if companies are traveling from one side asking, then back to the other side asking the same, but a bit more, and then going back and forth? And I think that is sort of the important sort of no-nonsense approach on both sides, that we need to have that kind of cooperation and dialogue.
So let me stay in this topic of industrial policy, because I think that is really now dominating conversations. And I certainly hear a very different tone when I go to Brussels today than what I heard even a couple of years ago. So now there is a lot of discussion on strategic autonomy and digital sovereignty, and this need to lean quite heavily on industrial policy. So the EU is spending over 40 billion on semiconductors, so that we are no longer 90%, but 80% dependent on foreign semiconductors. So it is a very expensive race to be engaging in. But at the same time, I think many would recognize that we are in a different geopolitical reality. that we cannot be wholly dependent on foreign technologies. We need to protect the strategic assets, and the entire world is moving to that same pace. If you look at the export controls that the Biden administration has in place, investment restrictions, so the heightening tech war between the US and China is really shaping the entire technology policy conversation. So maybe you could share some thoughts on what do you think that optimal decoupling looks like? And how can we make sure that industrial policy and kind of techno-protectionism doesn't get entrenched to the extent that we lose the benefits that still come from the EU's sort of history of being committed to open markets and open engagement. So if you can just look a little bit closer to that question of national security-driven technology policy and how do you see that ought to be implemented?
Well, we're in different positions. Europe is the biggest exporter of goods and services on the planet, bigger than the US. And the GDP measured in purchasing power is more or less the same and have been so for the last 10 years. And we have now in Europe, just to give you one example, the ambition to produce instead of 10% of world value of semiconductors to produce 20 is mirrored by in the US to go, I think, from 20 to 30%. If we're successful, we would together still only produce 50%. So we would not be self-reliant. And also in many things in a car, for instance, you need a full suite of semiconductors in order to make the thing work. And if you look at fully automatic cars, you need even more. And this is just to say that the point is not to be self-reliant. The point is to be much more assertive and a stronger participant in the global value and supply chains. Because there is no way that Europe can be fully self-reliant. Most of the strategic and critical raw materials that is in use comes from other parts of the planet. Same goes for the US. So the point is to say we need to be able to do more. We will be a better partner towards our international allies and like-minded if we can do more. And this is why, for instance, in semiconductors, it's important for us to establish more mega fabs with an open business model so that many more can design chips and have them done, to have, the full value chain from wafer production to the printing of chips to the packaging and testing within Europe. But we will not be alone in the world. We will still import a lot of semiconductors from Thailand, for instance, from Taiwan. And I think that is how the world has developed. I think what we're doing right now is that we're rather recalibrating globalization rather than we're canceling it. And I think it's a recalibration that's built on the fact that we cannot be monodependent on just one supplier. In Europe, we saw that the very, very hard way, the influence that Russia has on Europe, because a lot of the gas that we used to burn in Europe comes from Russia. That is over by now, very fast, but also, of course, very dramatic and very costly. And what we have learned from that is, of course, that we cannot repeat that. We need to have many more suppliers, and we need to be able to do more ourselves. So that, for me, is the ideal situation, that you have many more suppliers. So if one fails, you can go to another one and ask them to increase their supply. And we would want to be that same strong partners for like-minded allies out there.
Great. I want to shift a little bit gears just to make sure we have so many excellent student questions so that we can still get them in. So one of the students wanted to ask even more about the values behind these regulations and asking where these values come from and whose values do we talk about? Is there a common set of values across the different member states and individuals in those member states? And would those be universal values, or do you expect them to be shared in different parts of the world? Maybe especially if we connect this to the external impact that European rules have, they also operate in societies that may not share all the values of the Europeans. So maybe you can talk a little bit about those values and how universal they are.
Well, sometimes I find it difficult to talk about values because it can very easily be kind of an abstract discussion with a lot of very nice words. But that you say, yeah, but it's Tuesday, and do they actually apply? So I think any discussion about values need to be measured by your willingness actually to make something tangible in your everyday life. And I definitely do not think that all we believe in is universal. As said, we had just passed legislation that has put a ban on states having surveillance systems that will give their citizens points to measure what they can do or cannot do in their society. That is everyday reality for some citizens in China. So here you see really two different approaches. We say this should be forbidden. Others are actively promoting it to say this is a good thing. So I think definitely, even though we might say that every human being have a right to privacy, to be able to be in public space without being under surveillance one way or another, even though we think that this is a right for each and every one of us, no matter where we live, no matter where we come from, these are not rights that every citizen on this planet can actually exercise. And I think you see that even more. And I think that underlines that technology has become a new kind of foreign policy. And to some degree, renewing our discussions about human rights, because it becomes very, very concrete, very specific. What are actually my rights here? Do I have a right to privacy? Is it a real thing? Can I be forgotten? Can my data get taken down from the internet? Or will I forever be characterized by previous deeds? So I think the values that we try to fare, that you find in the Treaty of the European Union, how we see European way of life, we try, of course, to make that a real thing by the legislation and by enforcing the legislation, making sure that people can actually, in their everyday life, see that this is for real.
So very good. If we think about the values, and I think there are many values where the US and the EU can say that we share those values. Both are very committed to freedom of expression. So free speech is a European value. It is a very Central American value. But then when you manage issues like content moderation and discuss what kind of content ought to be taken down versus stay on, it can be that both the US and the EU agree that the goal ought to be to foster robust democracy and discussions that facilitate the attainment of that goal. But they may lead the Europeans to feel that we need to take that content down in the name of democracy so that we can protect civility of the discourse and protect individuals' dignity and protect them from hate speech, whereas Americans may invoke the concept of democracy as the very reason why that content ought to stay online. So that's why I would say that the legislations like the DSA, the Digital Services Act, has been quite contested because it really goes to this difficult question of how do you moderate content, and you can underdo it, you can overdo it, and it's really hard to draw that line. So the question is, who ought to be drawing that line? So maybe you can tell a little bit of how you see now the DSA enforcement unfolding. The test case that we now have is a particularly difficult one, that the first enforcement actions are taken against companies like X, that we all know has gutted its safety team, that doesn't have the full even capability to comply. And then we are seeing very harmful disinformation in the context of very heated debates around Israel, Hamas. And we also are gearing up for elections. Over 50 countries go to the polls this coming year. We are very worried about disinformation distorting the course of those democratic elections. So maybe you can still share a little bit of your views on content moderation, how Europeans see it while being very committed to freedom of expression, and whether you are optimistic that the DSA will be an effective tool to contain problems around hate speech, disinformation, and other harmful content.
I think it's a very good discussion, and especially to have a university where you would expect to have the necessary nuance. Because, for instance, I'm from Denmark, and in my country, hate speech is not allowed. It's illegal. You know, if you stand up in public space and you say something towards people of a different gender observation, you would actually risk to be taken to court. In the more extreme end, child abuse is illegal. It's illegal to distribute bomb recipes. If you stood up in front of the Danish parliament and handed out bomb recipes, you would be taken down within the minute. And the point of the Digital Services Act is basically to say this is illegal in the real physical world. It's also illegal in the online world, and it should be treated as such. And then, of course, starts the difficulty. Because one thing is a bomb recipe, one thing is child abuse, relatively easy to deal with. Hate speech, here you have a more obvious gray zone. And this is why in the Digital Services Act, if you're a big platform, you both have the obligation to make a risk assessment. Can my services be used to spread illegal content? What kind of mitigating measures would I put in place if there is this risk? But also to put in place a specific system for individual posts so that they can be taken down if seen to be illegal, but also that those whose posts are taken down can contest it. And that, of course, is also sort of an invitation eventually for the courts to relate to this, because if you have a gray zone, for instance, what is hate speech, then you need the courts to assess and to create some of the borders for that gray zone. And that is really tricky. For the most extreme kind of illegal contents, and also because most of these platforms, they have their own terms of service. For instance, in a Danish context, we're still sort of very surprised that you cannot show a naked boob on Facebook. We find that would be absolutely natural. But this is just to say that both in terms of taking out extremely illegal content, but also to live up to their own terms of service, these platforms do a lot of content moderation. Some of that, which takes, of course, a huge toll on the people doing it, because they have to look at a lot of very, very brutal thing out there, but it's not unknown of. It's not something that is, you know, absolutely new, but it's something that could pave the way for the different social media actually to be a place where you would have, you know, far-reaching freedom of speech, but what is considered illegal would actually not be there. And that is what we are thriving for. Because in most European countries, you have a very robust public debate, and you have no wish for censorship, but you find it legitimate that what the legislator have been deciding to be illegal actually should also be removed from social media.
Very good. I know we are short of time, so we have time for one question. So let me combine two student questions on AI Act, because AI clearly is on the minds of many. So one student asked whether the EU sees AI as one technology, and does the EU want to regulate AI as a technology, or rather the use of technology? And then another student wonders how enforcers in the EU can catch up with the technological complexity of AI. So really this regulatory capacity to effectively regulate, and whether also then the general public would need to have a better understanding of AI in order to really have a societally informed approach towards regulation.
Well, to take it from the top, we definitely do not think that artificial intelligence is just one technology. Artificial intelligence has been around for quite some time. I think most of us, we know it from recommender systems, from customer services. So very different approaches, but of course becoming more and more advanced with the big language models, neural systems, and probably we'll see even more in the future as technology advances. And our point of regulation is to regulate use cases. When it comes to general purpose AI, large language models, also some obligations as to how has this been developed, but very much focusing on how do you use it, because that is where harm can be done. And when it comes to regulatory capacity, a number of the obligations, and as said, many of them are asymmetrical. So the more capacity you have, the more risk potentially you can also evoke. Well, you also have a lot of things that you need to do yourself. I've been speaking a lot about risk assessments. These are risk assessments that are done by the companies who sets in place these different algorithms. But one of the things that I feel very strongly about is the access for researchers to look into algorithms, to look into ad libraries, to see how things are really working. Because that is creating a community around this, which doesn't just leave the enforcer, the businesses, the parties of the marketplace or their competitors and their customers, but also third parties to see what is actually going on. And I think that is absolutely critical. We can do so and so much, but we are publicly funded entities, so we have limited resources. But of course, we train our people. My services are in the process of hiring a chief technology officer. You see that in many more services of the European Commission. So slowly but surely, we make sure that our staff have the necessary competences, and we create numerous networks. Because without us having network effects of competences, we cannot see network effects when they show themselves in the marketplace. And I'm very encouraged by seeing how Berkeley engages in everything technology and prepares to use all these new opportunities that are opening themselves. Because we as regulator and as legislators can create doors, but of course, someone needs to turn the handle, someone needs to open them. Of course, we hope that many researchers and many groups of researchers and a network of researchers globally will make use of those new opportunities, because that will help us tremendously.
Wonderful. So, Executive Vice President, this has been a rich, wide-ranging conversation. I know we could continue for a long time. Thank you for terrific engagement and questions. And thank you for your commitment to your mandate and the openness with which you're willing to discuss that with different audiences. Thank you.
Thank you.
And feel free to come to more of our events. There's information there, and clap extra loud if you want these particular speakers to come back next year or in 2 years to tell them what they've been up to. It's been wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.